A few months ago, I directed my team at the White House to look into any new actions I can take to help reduce gun violence.
Sources say President Obama is expected to announce new executive action soon aimed at closing the so-called gun show loophole.
Laws and loopholes.
Gun show loophole.
Gun show loophole. I want to close the gun show loophole.
Well, what is the gun show loophole? So, at a normal, regular mom-and-pop gun store, a purchase looks like this. You walk into a store. That store is licensed. They ask for your ID and conduct a background check. And that background check finds out if you are a felon, a fugitive, a minor, addicted to a controlled substance, been kicked out of the military, been committed to a mental institution. If you checked one of those boxes, you're not getting a gun. So that leads us to the gun show loophole, which, according to this guy,
Kleck, professor of criminology and criminal justice at Florida State University.
calling it a gun show loophole isn't exactly correct.
It's a misnomer. It really doesn't have anything to do with gun shows in particular.
Because when people talk about
The gun show loophole.
Gun show loophole.
The gun show loophole?
they're really talking about private sales. Sales that happen outside of a licensed dealer, sales that don't have the same federal requirements. But for it to be considered a private sale, it doesn't necessarily just have to be a sale between two buddies.
Private sales could be through the internet. Private sales could be interstate.
So the big million-dollar question is, how many guns does one have to sell to be considered a private seller, and how many guns does one have to sell to be considered a dealer?
There is no number. There's just this vague language in the existing law that if you are in the business of selling guns, then you have to have a license.
And that definition of someone who's in the business of selling guns is exactly what President Obama's recent executive action was meant to clarify.
Anybody in the business of selling firearms must get a license and conduct background checks or be subject to criminal prosecutions.
The new regulations say that evidence of someone being in the gun business could include business cards, personalized packaging, having an online store, or just selling a lot of guns. But what the executive action didn't clarify is exactly how many sales it would take for someone to be considered a firearms dealer. So what's the big deal? Why does it matter who is a private seller and who isn't? Well, it's a big deal because a licensed gun seller, this guy, he has to run a background check on every purchase that he sells. A private gun seller, he doesn't have to run any background checks, none. The law only says that the private seller has to think the buyer will pass a background test. So you might be asking, what does it mean for a seller to think someone is okay to buy a gun? So that's different than, say, a bar selling to someone underage. If the kid's underage, that bar is getting in trouble, even if the guy shows a fake ID and swears he's 21. But with private gun sales, the seller only needs to think that the exchange is legal. They don't have to prove it, and if they're wrong, they're not liable. And since the seller doesn't have to ask for ID, the seller is only really liable if the buyer says that he's a felon, like this.
Yep, I am definitely a felon.
So in this situation, if the sale does go through, then the seller is liable. But, on the other hand, if the felon flat out lies,
I'm not a felon.
the seller isn't liable at all. He's totally good.
Well, all right.
Because a private gun seller only needs to think that the person he's selling to isn't a felon, or a fugitive, or a minor, or addicted to a controlled substance, or been kicked out of the military, or been committed to a mental institution. And if they're wrong, well, it's not their problem. And that is the gun show loophole.